Thank you for those kind words. It's my wife and I, Mia right over here, my kids are out there by the books. Are very thrilled to be here and to be, to have this opportunity to talk with you. I know that it's been, I think, 3 years since really we've been all able to come together in this COVID era. And as an emergency room doctor, I was just talking to, people here about what that experience was in the emergency room when those first patients started rolling in. And, I never signed up to be on the front lines. I always think of firefighters or police officers or the army. And then when COVID started hitting, I was like, I can't quit my job in the emergency room, then I will wind up messing up all of my patients. So, we all dealt with what it was like to be on those front lines of COVID. And, it brought all sorts of interesting stories. And, I never wanted to come into my house with the clothes that I wore during COVID. And it was always a trick to try to figure out how to get out of my COVID clothes into clothes that I wanted to be at home. And I used to keep in my front foyer like a set of pajamas because I'd come home late from the emergency room. I kept the set of pajamas right in my front foyer and I would get undressed right there. And then put those clothes in a bag, seal that bag, get into new clothes, sanitize, and I think we've come pretty far, and I am happy that we're all here to be able to do it together. So the Jewish History of Tannersville, it's today what we'll wind up going through, and I'll use the slides sometimes as a main part and sometimes just to bounce, to be able to talk about certain things. So there's acknowledgments. We'll talk about my father-in-law, Rene Slotkin, who some of you may have known, and of course Rabbi Farber, which are my main connections to Tannersville. And then we'll talk about why do we record history, why is the history of the Jewish history, what do we have to offer to the greater history. Then we'll talk a little bit about Tannersville. I wasn't sure what type of crowd, if it was going to be people that were tourists, if it was going to be people that were holding into the Tannersville history, so we will move more quickly through that, I see. And then traveling to the mountains, and then we'll talk about the families that made up, because to me history is really important to really talk about the families that made up this history. We can talk about the presidents and the senators and all the armies, but in terms of local history, it's about family. And Mountaintop really is about family. And, my wife and I spent Shabbos here. We used to come up here every summer when my in-laws were working with the Farbers in the camp. And when Rabbi Farber died, the camp was sold, and so my in-laws, who were best friends with the Farbers, stopped coming up as well because the house that they were using was sold as part of the camp property. And so we really haven't had that opportunity to be in Tannersville, but we came up for this Shabbos, and I will tell you, in order to give this talk, a prerequisite is spending time in the community, walking around, seeing the old faces, and I got so many hugs this past Shabbos. It really is a greater extended family. And we had, the local Tannersville police officer, one of him, Travis, came by to the house, and we were talking about Rene. And Travis shared how he wrote an essay about Rene when he was in high school. And, just seeing even, the locals, there is a very, personal relationship between, the communities, both the established communities and the visitors. And we'll talk about that, those two groups. So, of course, today doesn't come, together without a lot of people being involved. So the Mountaintop Historical Society, Dee Dee, who is now my best friend, she and I text, and we try to figure things out. Mara, who was persistent and patient with me as my hours can be a little bit wonky, and thank you, Mara, for putting up with that. And John Hamm, I don't know if he's, there's the man. And so John also was always available, and I would ask him, can I use this image from your book? And he said, sure. And then he would send me that image. And if I had any questions, I said, I read this about terrains. And he's like, let me tell you, this is really how it was. And so I appreciated that. And then the Anshe Hasharon community. When I say Anshe Hasharon, I'm referring to the synagogue. And so there's different rabbis, Rabbi Bernstein, who's the current rabbi, Rabbi Bella, Rabbi Spitzer, who are basically cover the rabbinate of the last 40 years in Sharon. And then the two people that preceded me in writing a history were Dr. Halberstam and Jacob Halberstam and Beezy Halberstam, and Bertram Schwarzbach, who had been put down over there, which I apologize. You know, whenever you have an acknowledgement, there's always something you forgot. So I apologize. And then Lauren Levy is a coworker who just, I'm not very PowerPoint savvy. And so she said, Dr. Lelonek, let me help you. There are some good tricks that we can do. And so I hope that I make her proud. Okay, so these are the generations. Whenever you have an introduction to, you know, a connection, restarting like a parsha in the Torah, you talk about Eila Toldos. These are the generations. Because the Torah and any histories it talks about people and families. So these are the generations. So why did I get interested in the history of Tannersville? I married into a family that's been part of the mountaintop. And I do have a natural proclivity for interest in history. Part of just the way I study Torah is I try to understand the historical context of what was going around, what's happening to the Jews during that time period, and how did they respond to that. So I was reading through Dr. Halberstam's and Schwarzbach's histories, and I noticed that on the one of the founders of the synagogue, his name was Abraham Weinhandler. And I was like, that name is really strikes a chord. And I looked through my own family's documents, and I said, oh, on my great-grandfather's ship manifest, there was an A. Weinhandler who was his sponsor to come to America. And I was like, wait. And then I researched the A. Weinhandler for Tannersville, and then I did more research into the A. Weinhandler, who was an elusive family member. I had asked my grandmother, I was like, do you ever remember an Abraham Weinhandler? She had a gentle laugh. No, Gary. I was like, okay. So she didn't know. And then after doing some research, I realized that this was the same Abraham Weinhandler who was a second cousin to my great-great-grandfather when he came to America, and he sponsored him to come over. And without this sponsorship, my great-grandparents would never have been able to arrive. And then I did some research into Abraham Weinhandler, and his son was a lawyer, and his son was good friends with the New York State Supreme Court Justice, Justice Leventritt, and he was housing Justice Leventritt here in the mountains, and he wrote an affidavit in 1908 for some sort of lawsuit. And in the affidavit, he says, I'm here in Tannersville where my family has been spending over 20 summers. And I was like, whoa, 1888. Now we're back in the real, the throes of the beginnings of the Jewish presence on the mountain. And so that's how I came to it. And I was just very happy to share with the community, as my way of giving back to the community to publish this. And actually, all the proceeds of the book go straight towards the community, towards the upkeep of the synagogue and upkeep of just supporting the community at large. So this is my father-in-law right over here, Rene. Okay, and this is Rabbi Farber. Okay, and sweet people. And just my father-in-law, we just finished the 30 days of mourning for my father-in-law. He died 5 weeks ago, and I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity to, I see heads shaking, but he was a Holocaust survivor, and the mountain offered a ton of refuge and solace for survivors. It was part of their recuperation from what they experienced, to see life continuing. And he was an incredibly, a man who was full of faith. Just to tell you a quick story about him is he had numbers on his arm. He was a child. He was 6 when he went to Auschwitz, and he was born in 1937, wound up in Auschwitz in 1944, and he was a twin survivor. And his parents were murdered. His father, who was not Jewish, who was taken as a political prisoner because he wouldn't separate from his Jewish wife, and so he was murdered in Auschwitz in 1941. And then in 1944, they kept he and his sister, her twin sister, together with their mother. And then on July 19th, 1944, his mother was murdered. And but the story really was also that the reason why he and his sister survived as 6-year-olds, because there are no children at that age that survived, was because he was what we call a Mangala twin. He and his sister were experimented on. He was the control, and she was the experiment. They both survived, and they both had families. You know, there is a happy ending to this. But he had numbers on his arm. And so his numbers were 16190, something along those lines. And he would add them up. And so when they faced him, they added to 26. But when they faced everybody else, the 6s became 9s, and the 9s became 6s. In other words, all the numbers are reversible. Okay? So when you would see the sum of 23. You know, and most of us would just say, okay, there are numbers on his arm, and they were rather large because he was a little kid when they first happened, so they grew with him. And he said 26 to him went the numerical value of God's name. And so he said, God was always with me, and the Nazis put God on my arm, and that's what he would say. And then when you saw 23, he said, that's chapter 23 of Tehillim. Here, when I walk in the valley of death, God, you are with me. And that's the way he was, is that he could be through the horrors and really see the goodness and be able to appreciate. And that's the way he walked around. And people talk about his warmth and his love. And so this is, I'm proud to be his son-in-law. Okay, so this is just a general history of Tannersville. Again, I wasn't sure exactly how the crowd would be. And so we'll sort of just move through this, 1738 is the earliest record I find of Tannersville. They were selling rum. Good choice. And this actually comes from a newspaper article in 1913 around, or 1914, when Martin Hotel was being torn down. It was bought by one of the part of the Golding family. We'll get to them later. And it said in the article that they had it, this is when they got their rum license, was 1738. So that's where my source is. And, then we have our tanneries coming, and then we have, Colonel William Edward joining the scene right over here. And there are records of Jacob the Jew, who was employed by, by the tannery. So we already have some Jewish presence. And then we have Harlow Perkins and Norman Gray, which they're not Jewish, but they are just part of Tannersville history, and the Rogan House, and then the railroad, and then Onteora and Elka Park. And at this point in this is a time period when we really start to have a documented record of Jews visiting the mountaintop, which is part of when Tannersville had its boom in terms of the boarding house boom. It's with the railroads being completed, people being able to get up the Hudson more easily, because because at this point we had the major hotels, the Catskills, the Mountain House, they were over here, and so this is when Tannersville really started having the boarding house boom. And then you have the towns incorporated, the telephone services introduced, and then Anshe Sharon is incorporated, and Anshe Sharon is the synagogue. Okay, I just love these pictures. This comes from the Wiltsey book, and I just think it's wonderful. I know there's been a lot more bear sightings and mama cubs, and so this is just I grew up with Marty Stauffer, Wild America. Does anybody know what that was? And he had a pet lion. And so I remember, and you'd be like, what? But he was like, I'm Marty Stauffer, and this is Wild America. So this is Wild Tannersville, or domesticated bears, I don't know. Okay, so this is, Tannersville was in itself its own community, and it ran, and it had its own Mountains National Bank. I know the bank is a sponsor. I did not do this on purpose, but this is money that was printed in Tannersville. So the Federal Reserve at that point did not, they would allow local banks to have a contract to print out their own local currency. I'm sure there was some regulation, but they stopped this after a while. But this is a Tannersville dollar, and I would love, personally, I'm not asking anybody to buy me a dollar, but I would love one of these. I'm sure all of you would love one of these, because this is really fantastic. And this is the back of that dollar, and you'll just, just in terms of the time period, you see the steamboats, in the background. And it says here that this dollar can be used in any part of the country for any taxes, debts, or, to acquire products. I can't believe that. That's so awesome. Okay. He's a handsome-looking man.
Was he president?
Yeah.
He was president then.
Yeah. I don't know if he was president during this time. I wasn't holding, that much, but this is real money. But don't spend it if you got it today. Be smart. Use your credit card. Jewish immigration to America. So the immigration to America, Jews did not leave their homeland easily. They did not do it because they were just looking for a good old time. They heard it's nice in Florida. They only left under duress. Why? Because I can tell you, when I wrote my grandfather's history, he said his family had lived in the same town for over 900 years. You don't just pick up and leave a place after 900 years. That is your home. That is your country. So the Jewish immigration to America was a product of persecution. Okay? And so when an immigrant came to these shores, they felt they had to deal with a number of challenges. And it's just a challenge of re-establishing oneself. The xenophobia, fear of just immigrants, anti-Semitism, was very much part of America, the mountaintop, poverty. And then also that in addition to just establishing oneself, it's always been a very important thing to Jews to maintain their heritage. I can tell you that in 1939, when my grandfather was a Polish partisan, and he fought in the Second Warsaw Uprising in 1944, and then he was caught by Stalin. He was declared dead by the Russians, and Yom Kippur of 1944, his family sat Shiva for him. And then after the war, he sent them telegrams saying, "Hey, I'm in Germany," and they said they didn't believe he was alive, because the mail system in post-World War II was so messed up that people were getting mail from deceased relatives all the time. And so he said it took 3 telegrams for them to actually believe that he was alive. And that's when and he said, "I'm not joining you there." But in any case, I'm digressing slightly. But in 1939, when as Kristallnacht was happening, he was having a debate with his father what they should do. Should they stay in Poland, or should they go to the Russian-occupied side of Poland? And his father said, "If I stay here, we've been through 900 years. Things have come and gone. This too will pass." And he said, "But if we go to Russia, then we lose our religion." And so he debated with his father whether or not they should stay. He eventually did, convince his entire family to go to Russia, and that's what saved them. But they were mortified at the concept of potentially giving up their religion. And that was something that immigrants always faced, that they didn't have their communal structures that were necessary to being able to transmit what was so important to them. And their kids were also even more at risk. And then of course there was the motto, if you don't come to work on Saturday, then don't come on Sunday, was something that was always said. And so without the communal structures, they did want to be away from outside influences. And so, and they sought out places that were similar to their homelands. They did not want to go to the big cities most in the beginning of the immigration. They only started really staying in New York once they had family members there. Again, family is among the most important things that always keeps us together. And they sought out people that were similar to them, okay? So what we all know about the Tannersville always held, a lot of allure to us. And this was just to the general American, the allure of Tannersville. And so why Tannersville for the immigrant Jewish population? So this is a great book that talks about how the first immigrants actually did not settle in big cities, that they went to rural America. This came up over Shabbos with somebody, and that's how I got this book, was someone introduced it to me over Shabbos, and so that's why I updated my slides today. So they wanted to be left alone. They didn't want persecution. They just leave us alone. I'll find my mountain house, and I'm happy to be away from the big city. They avoided persecution. They wanted family. They saw the mountains. There was Zionist conventions that were held there because it reminded them of Zion. It was just something that evoked powerful memories. We can all talk about the spirituality of the mountain, social equality, financial opportunity. The mountain was the frontier at this point. The rapid development of the mountain in the 1880s, the 1870s was a fertile ground for immigrants because it was an opportunity. Self-determination, in other words, America offered a lot less taxation, a lot more opportunity for ownership and businesses, which are heavily restricted in Russia and in Europe. And it's not the city, which is still the reason why people are here. And for visitors, it would be an escape, okay? And what did they do? They brought their families with them. That was always the talk about the immigrant, was that they would say, they would save up money. They would work night and day in order to bring over their brother, their sister, this one and that one. They wanted to be financially secure. They were very hardworking. They built businesses. They networked with other Jews. There always has been a natural sense of being able to network with other Jews. It just was something they felt much more comfortable with, because there was a tremendous amount of distrust for hundreds of years. When you had the Cossacks coming through and the pogroms coming through, you didn't have the sense that you could trust your neighbor. And that was something that was a big adaptation of the immigrant here in America, was being able to have a sense that you're not under constant threat from your not Jewish neighbor. And also just psychologically, there's a book called that America is called a manic nation. The incidence of bipolar disorder. I'm a psychiatrist. The incidence of bipolar disorder is much higher here in America than it is in Europe. And the question is why. Israel also has a similarly higher rate of manic mania. So mania is where someone has too much energy, doesn't need to sleep as much, is less risk averse. Which, if you think of the typical immigrant, would be great characteristics for being able to pick up and leave establishment, to be able to work hard, and to be less risk averse. And so, because we are an immigrant nation here in America that's only 400 years old, so the immigrants, whether it was Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish, or Muslim, are always people that were willing to leave home. And so we actually see that in their, in bipolar disorder. But so, they were less risk averse, and they were pretty gritty people. Okay, so communal goals, they also wanted to build up what would be things that would be continue their own heritage. Schools, synagogues, and ritual baths. Okay, so why would people choose Tannersville? Well, why would the immigrant choose Tannersville? So you really have, whenever you talk about Tannersville, there's always going to be two different populations. You're going to have the boarders, the visitors, and you're going to have the settlers. And really, when you think about the Jewish population on the mountain, it's really helpful to think of that dichotomy, because that really defines the two different groups. Okay, and essentially, if you want to think of it, also can be vacation destination versus establishing a home, and it's going to talk about the socioeconomics of those different groups. Their resources, their assimilation are all going to be able to fall into those two different categories. Okay, so here's what was known about Tannersville in terms of its welcoming nature to Jews. This is from the Rad McNally brochure in 1893. Comes from the Internet Archive. It says, able and willing to accommodate anybody vying with other places. I don't have a great angle. Okay, but he says this is a great resort in particular for our Israelitish. That actually is what it says there, and I did not correct it. I'd never have heard of that word, and they tried to spell correct me a lot. But Israelitish brethren who love to gather where they can be together. So again, that talks about the same things, the internal trust, the community. Even if they were vacationing, they wanted to be together. This has come from a vacation mountain. This is from 1896. The town is sometimes called Jerusalem because so many of our people are there in the summer. And this comes from the American Zionist Convention. The Jewish colony that inhabits Tannersville during the summer had not yet arrived, but the signs of their occupancy in the village lent a home-like aspect to the locality. The Zionist flags fluttered from many houses, as well as from the hotel where the majority of delegates stayed and where the sessions of the convention took place. The encircling mountains were a fitting setting to the meeting place of men and women whose hopes are fixed on Zion. So this is, as you can see, from 1893, 1896, and 1907, there was already a boarding house established population. Okay? But Jews were not always welcome every place in Tannersville. This is from a Germania Washington Park cottage, and it says no Jews taken. Very clearly, they weren't welcome wherever there was. Not every place wanted them. Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit quicker through this part because you guys are all familiar with the mountaintop. But this is just, I love this. There's little excuse for remaining in town. Your wife is sick and tired of society. The children long for the annual romp among the green hills. The whole family is gasping for fresh air. Truth, thus it is wisely that people dismiss their servants, again speaks to the socioeconomics of this situation, lock up their townhouses, pack up some necessary wearing apparel, and buy tickets for the mountain. I think the same is true today. I think that really describes me as being sick and tired, but okay. So this is, again, I'm going to run through this. This is a typical steamship that would bring up, it started in 1802 with, early 1800s. Fulton steamship was the first one to go up the Hudson. This is not his steamship. This is a much bigger one. And so I love this. This is a great sketch of what, so here they would disembark at the Catskill landing, and then they would pick up a train, and then the train would take them to the Otis elevating railroad. And John, you'll have to tell me if I'm doing okay with this part. And then you can see that there's different places that you could pick up another train that would take you to Tannersville from the mountaintop. And the Otis elevating railroad, I'll zoom through, was a fantastic, innovation for the mountain. Here it is, the 1,700-foot peak. It was really fantastic. It was 2 cars. Here we go. This is just, we'll do this video.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. So here they are. It's the early 1900s, and there's the Catskill Mountain House is right over here, and they would do a 1,600-foot ascent in only 10 minutes. Quite an accomplishment for something that took 5 to 6 hours by stagecoach. And there were some people that would have to get out of the stagecoach and have to walk for parts. And yeah, we'll talk about that. There's the mountain house again. And here's where the 2 cars, one would come down the mountain and one would go up the mountain simultaneously. And that was part of the way the system worked, and it was rigged, and so that they would pass right over here. Okay. And my videos are working fantastic. John, am I doing good?
Yeah, we got it.
Excellent. Okay, there they go. Okay. And then this is, I think, that must have been the most harrowing part, because here you are going over a ravine. That was where they had that basket they would send down to people who were, scaling the rocks.
No.
No? Okay. I take it back. I scratched that from the record. What?
No problem.
No problem. Okay. And here they are arriving at the top of the mountain. They would disembark over here, and then they would go to Tannersville, ran 6 miles to the village, where they connected with the standard gauge Ulster and Delaware. Okay, and this is the famous picture. I'm sure all of you, I see a lot of head shaking, beautifully dressed. It was quite a thing to go ride on the trains, and here's, there's stories about the hotels would send their livery pickup people to the local train station, because there was a high amount of competition that if you didn't have your livery person there, that some other hotel would take them to their hotel. So that was important. Okay, and here's just a souvenir book, that was available at that time period. And again, I'm going to move rather quickly through this. Okay, borders and settlers. Again, this is going to be the themes that we're going to talk about. Okay, we're doing okay. Okay, so John, there we are. Thank you. So this is a map, a topographical map of Tannersville, and it shows the distribution of the various hotels, along, Tannersville. And so here's the Rip Van Winkle Lake. Here's the Tannersville racetrack, and the current synagogue is over here. Originally it was over here, and here's a list of the various hotels. And you can see, really, it was a resort village. Okay, so here we have one of the earlier visitors to Tannersville. His name is Julius Eisenstein. He was a historian, and what's really remarkable about this is that he first talks about the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge right over here, and he says, "Today is the second day the Brooklyn Bridge was open, and I walked across the Brooklyn Bridge." And then his very next entry is then, "Today I went up to Tannersville." And you still have to, if you're coming from Brooklyn, you still need to go over that bridge to get to Tannersville. So this is, and so he talks about staying by Jacobson, and that, that he came up on on what morning he came up and the day he left, and when he left, came back home. You know, he actually also does a fantastic entry for the opening of the Statue of Liberty as well from the same historian. I have that on my computer. I did not put that in here, but he was into chronology. Okay, here's Abraham Kahan, who was a famous journalist, and he wrote The Rise of David Levinsky, which captures like Tannersville hunter, you know, of that time period, and he talks about how whenever the Star Spangled Banner was played in the local hotels, the Jewish hotels, the amount of pride that they swelled up in all the visitors, and how they really cried and saluted the flag that was giving them, you know, peace and safety on the mountain. And they had a tremendous sense of gratitude to America. Yes, and he talks about their new wealth and, you know, the jingle of newly acquired dollars in our and expensive clothes. But there was applause. There was something else as well. Many of those who were now paying tribute to Stars and Stripes were listening to the tune with grave, solemn mien. It was as if they were saying, "We are not persecuted under this flag. At last we have found a home. My country," they cried. And they said, and they asked them to play it again. So this was the immigrant. Even if they were successful, it was only relative success in terms of recent success. Okay? This is from an 1893. And so whenever you had the immigrant come to America, there was a tension that would arise between the established Jews, the Jews that had been here for multiple generations, and the newly arrived immigrant. The newly arrived immigrant was typically more religious than the more established Jew in America, and that was primarily as a lack of communal structures. In other words, you didn't have the ability to not work on Saturday, you didn't have the ability to send your kid to a parochial school, and you didn't have the opportunity to have a ritual bath. So without those, it eroded a lot of the observance. So here you see that there was a reverend doctor who refused to speak in the local synagogue. He said he'd rather speak in a church, and that he refused to wear a yarmulke. And then they say that even the local priest knows to put on a yarmulke when he comes into, you know, the synagogue. And so there was this tension. It also speaks earlier in the article about a lot of the activities, the fundraising that was going on, that they were setting up benevolent societies, and they were setting up hospitals, and all the fundraising that would happen in the local hotels. Again, about building a social structure, of being able to take care of both their own brethren and anybody else that needed help, and also starting to build communal structures. Okay, so this is the Fairmont Hotel, which Simon Jacobson ran, and he was known for his very stringent religious standards, that he was known to kick out people who tried to eat not kosher in his hotel. He was also known that if you were staying there, you were expected to observe the Sabbath and its laws according to tradition, and if not, you were free to leave. So, and he was actually he was a what we call a chazan. I guess what's a chazan? The good translation. A cantor. Thank you. He was a cantor for the Jewish Theological Seminary, and this is actually where the American Zionist conference would be held. 1906, 07, and 11, and you actually had delegates from all over the country, and Israel and Palestine, all over the world would come together. Anybody heard of the poem Hatikva? Yes. Which is so Naftali Imber, the author of the Hatikva, stayed here, and for this convention. There's other connections. There's not to this part, but Jabotinsky died actually in Hunter, and he was. Zeev Jabotinsky, who was one of the founders of the Zionist movement in Israel, and he was buried in Hunter. No, he wasn't buried in Hunter. Excuse me. He was what we call a Beit Gvurot. He was a Beit Taharot. He was given his ritual ending of life and cleansing of his body here in Hunter, and then he was buried in Montefiore and in the city in Long Island. And then it was the current prime minister of Israel at the time was his political rival, and would not allow his body be buried in Israel. And it took till Golda Meir came on, and she allowed his body to be reinterred and buried in Israel. So, okay. But here's again more of me just having fun. Here's the racetrack, was there. And this is I can't find this postcard online, but I happened to have taken a picture of this when I was by Rip Van Winkle Lake a number of years ago. and this is from Bob Maison. But it's really fantastic. You really see, you know, what the
That's what it looked like. wasn't it?
yeah.
The building at the right was never there.
This one?
No, the right.
That might be a future,
Okay.
future,
Rendition.
Yeah.
what they were planning.
Okay.
I found the lake is bigger than
Well, this was not, again, it sounds like this was what they planned on doing and not what was. It was an expansion of a natural stream that was already there, and, you know, yeah?
Still there.
It's still there. Okay, yes. Okay, so this is a picture of the convention. You know, some of the delegates. This is actually Solomon Schechter right over here, who's the head of the conservative movement. Okay, right over there. And so here they are on the lawn, finely dressed people. Here's Solomon Schechter again with his students and the other heads of the Jewish Theological Seminary, again here for the convention. Oh, so now we're moving into the 20s, a little bit fast forward. This is boxer Benny Leonard. I did not know about Benny Leonard until I started doing the history. And he was the ghetto wizard. He was a lightweight champion for 7.5 years. ESPN marks him as number 7 on their all-time list of boxers. And he trained here in Tannersville. So I love this picture because all 3 men are actually in midair. You see that the shadow is underneath their feet. Yeah, it's amazing. But his parents were Orthodox. He hid his boxing. You know, there's a famous story in Jewish history of Hillel by the skylight trying to learn as much Torah as he can. Well, boxer Benny Leonard had a similar situation. He actually was too poor to get into the ring, but he went up to the skylight to watch. He fell through the skylight, and that was his, in order to help pay for the broken skylight. That was his first bout, and he lost. But it would take another, after that bout, I think there was one more bout he lost, and it would be 7.5 years until he lost again. Okay, settlers. So of course we talk about the Honigsbaums. You know, I know we have, do we have any Honigsbaums here? Okay, there we are. Excellent. So Doe Beryl came over in 1892. This is according to the synagogue's history that Schwarzbach wrote in 1974. And apparently he got up to the mountaintop and then died. Had a heart attack. But he was joined soon by at least 4 of his kids that I could count. So we know Frank and Sarah Honigsbaum, onto, you know, were stalwarts of the Jewish community, Michael and Tilly. And then this was what was really cool to me, is that when I was preparing for this talk, I realized that the Olinskis, Olin was a Honigsbaum, and Abrams was a Honigsbaum. And these were, they all went on to establish, stores and businesses in the community. Honigsbaum and Denby's from this line, the grocery store from Michael and Tilly and their son. The Olinskis ran Olin's Hotel. He was a tinsmith, a hardware and plumbing. And then Abrams, he had a drugs and toiletry. And I know that because when they had the Zionist convention here, they actually wrote a fictional account of what Rip Van Winkle's experience would be like in Tannersville if he woke up in the middle of the convention. And he's like wandering through town, and he described how he sees Abrams toiletries, and he sees someone holding a chicken upside down and talking to some women, and he's like, oh, I'm getting really tired, and he finds the place. He finds a religious place to sleep, and he thinks it's a cross, and he wakes up and he sees it's the star. He's like, and so this fictional account was him waking up and he comes into the actual fictional account. It continues that he goes into the convention, and he sees these very old-looking. He says, "I think I heard the word Hebrews." He's like, "I think I remember that from my biblical school," and then the fictional account has Naftali Imber, the author of Hatikva, being his friend, and that they spend time together. It's fantastic. It's actually at the end of the book. I include that entire account. Okay. Americanization. So this is the announcement that Olinsky now is going to be changed to Olin. This was again part of the immigrant experience, was dropping, not completely changing the names, but becoming a little bit more American. Okay. Now, social media. You know, we all talk about social media today, and we tell our kids, or we tell ourselves, make sure you're smart about what you post. Now, what was the social media in that time? Anyone want to? Newspaper. Thank you. So here we are. This is the general interest. Here we have you know, here we are. Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Olin are spending a few weeks in New York City with their daughters. How nice. Uh-oh. Don't post what you don't want people to know. What's not a good idea in 2022 is not such a good in 1922 or 29. He got robbed. If you tell people you're not home, it's gonna come back to bite you. During an absence, which they announced, Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Olin, who were visiting their few weeks in New York City, someone entered their place by removing a panel from a door. The visitor helped himself to a number of things. Mr. Olin conducts a large store of toys, hardware, and household furnishings, and carries a large stock. It is quite hard to tell about what is missing. The assailant is still at large. Like, if you see him, let me know. Okay. So, but the Honigsbaums and the Olins, they did join the community, so they were part of the year-round residents. And here we have, this comes from Wiltsey's book, that the Honigsbaums were part of the baseball team. The local Honigsbaums, sorry, thank you. They're part of the local baseball team. And the Honigsbaum also actually were major contributors to building the synagogue. They actually were major reasons why there was a Jewish parochial school on the mountain in the early 1900s that had a teacher. They actually built the first ritual bath. And Sarah Honigsbaum was known for her piety, for housing visitors, doing that mitzvah. And so she really was, the matriarch of the Jewish community on the mountain. Okay? But, so eventually the Jewish community, and at this point in 1899, you had some boarders that had bought homes here in Tannersville. And so they recognized that they wanted to not just hold local services in the local auditorium of Fairmont Hotel, but they wanted a place of their own. And so this is Anshe Sharon. Now, this is not where it is today. Yes, this is opposite Tops, the Tops supermarket. Yeah. So no, Tops was across the street, and so this would be facing Tops today.
Tops was not around.
No, it was not. It was a Waverly Hotel. But I don't know if anybody would know where Waverly was, so we'll stick with Tops. Grand Union, I know. No, a blessed memory.
Grand Union used to be on Main Street next to Rexall's.
Yep. Okay, so this is the original synagogue.
That was A&P. A&P.
And there was a Grand Union in the old postcards, so I don't know. We can take it outside, guys. Okay, here's the interior of the synagogue today. It's gorgeous, and you'll notice that the same colored windows are still evident. It's all really the same. Actually, Isaac Olin did part of the interior of this. Okay, and here's the same memorial plaque that is actually in the front. I did not steal it. I got permission to bring it today. But it lists, the Honigsbaum family. On the front, the top is Frank Honigsbaum, and his wife is over here. And Olin is on here, and there's a bunch of other names I'm sure you will recognize better than I will. Okay? This is from the 1918, I believe, 17, excuse me. And here we have the two synagogues. There were never two synagogues. It was, a building was bought for the Talmud Torah, or the parochial school, but it really was, it's not clear how much of it ever got built. But the Talmud Torah, which was an official association, merged with the Anshe Hasharon. So the two synagogues at Tannersville and the Catskills are planning to unite a Talmud Torah for local needs is in course of establishment. Again, we're talking about the established community that was here, the Jews that were part of the community, who wanted to be able to teach their kids. Funds are being raised, $1,000 having already been secured. Okay? Then you had Sam and Yessel Warm. Of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention the Warm family and their presence. Do we have Warms here, or anybody? Excellent, good. I'm sorry to give you a shout out without telling you beforehand. Excellent. So Sam and Yessel, came up the mountain, and they were part of they became a really important members of the community. I think that one of the Warms served as mayor at some point. Okay. And then here, just moving on from the established residents, here's one of our border families, the Goldings, who started coming up in 1910s. Mr. Golding's father died on the mountaintop. and here they are. It's a very sweet gold. You know, there's the Golden Girls, and you know, the Blanche and what were the other Golden Girls' names? What? Rue, right? The Golden Girls. So we have our version of the Golden Girls, and these Golden Girls were something else. Really were amazing. Necha Golding, her sister-in-laws and her were major supporters of Jewish institutions all along the East Coast. And there's actually a famous rabbi, his name is called the Chafetz Chaim, who lived in Radin. And there's a story that's told that a traveler once went to Radin and asked the Chafetz Chaim, they say, Chafetz Chaim, why don't you have any furniture? He lived in very sparse conditions. And he says, well, Mrs. Gold, he said, I gave it away, but he said, a traveler, he says, well, why don't you have any possessions with you? She goes, well, I'm a traveler. He goes, me too. We're all travelers here. And that actually is a story about her visit to the Chafetz Chaim. And at the other part of the story was that she goes to the Chafetz Chaim, she goes, a good year to you, Chafetz Chaim. And he says, a good year to you, Mrs. Golding. And he goes, then she takes a couple of she goes, a good year to you, Chafetz Chaim. And he goes, a good year to you, Mrs. Golding. And they leave, and her son goes, Mom, you said that twice. She goes, I know. When you have an opportunity to get a blessing from the rabbi of your generation, you go for another one. And so, but Mrs. Golding this is a picture of her son, and they had their own farm, and they milked their own cows. We call it, you know, so they had milk for themselves. This is the gazebo that's on their property, and I'm sure the roof has been changed, but it's the same gazebo. Still there. And
They didn't change anything.
no.
I saw it yesterday.
Yeah. So what's really amazing about this gazebo is that almost every great Torah scholar from 1910s to 1950s from Europe and Russia, whenever they came to America, they all stayed by the Goldings up in Tannersville. And they all learned in this gazebo. And whenever there's big rabbis that do come up to the mountaintop, almost all of them take time to learn in this gazebo, because there's a sense, and Rav Schachter, who's a tremendous, one of the greatest rabbis of today, who stays every summer in Tannersville. He gave a lecture yesterday about one of the things that's really important about learning and praying in the same space is that you interconnect with your own self over that time period, and all the previous generations that have been in that same exact space are become interconnected when you're learning or praying in that same space. And so he said that when you have an opportunity to learn in the same exact place that all these great rabbis, you're interconnecting with their spirituality.
Where is this gazebo?
Rav Aaron Cutler was another,
Where's that?
South
Yes.
Main.
South Main?
yeah, right by the synagogue.
Oh.
Okay. Rav Aaron Cutler was also a big rabbi who was supported by the Goldings. He went on to establish the major yeshiva in Lakewood. And so he was, his first fundraising meeting was held by Mrs. Golding in her apartment in the city. But what I love about this is that Mrs. Golding's son actually served in the American Army. And this is a letter that Rav Aaron Cutler, who's the head rabbi of his yeshiva, wrote to Mrs. Golding's son while he was in the army. And he says that may the Almighty safeguard you and speed you back home after this victorious conclusion of this Melchanes Mitzvah, which is a war that it's a commanded. In other words, this is a holy war, but not in terms like a crusade, like a holy war protecting life, liberty, and so against America, enemies of America, and freedom as well for the Jewish people.
When was that?
I don't have a date on this one, but here's the letter that Mrs. Golding sent out to her friends about how important it is to support Rabbi Cutler, and I can't see the date over there.
36. 36.
36. Okay. And these are other great rabbis that she housed. This is Rav Baruch Ber Leibowitz. This is Rav Elchanan Wasserman. He did die in the Holocaust. They begged him not to go back. This is Rav Mordechai Epstein, who stayed in her house. And he, eventually said, this is a letter that Mrs. Epstein, Rabbi Epstein's wife, wrote to Mrs. Golding, thanking her for her hospitality here in Tannersville.
1926.
Of housing her husband. And the Goldings, they were philanthropists, so when someone stayed by them, they gave them the equivalent of whatever they would have raised during their time at their house, so that they could really just rest and learn and enjoy the mountain air. Okay, and this is actually a letter that that Rabbi Goldstein wrote to Mrs. Golding when her son died on the day of his bar mitzvah. And so it's a translation, and I could send it to you, but it's a beautifully written eulogy and way of giving comfort to the Goldings on the loss of their beloved son. And of course, then we bring to the 1950s, and really the 1950s were important because Mrs. Golding died in the early 50s. Mrs. Honigsbaum died in the 30s. So the Jewish community is going to evolve, and really that brings us to Rabbi Breuer. Rabbi Breuer, his grandfather was Samson Farrell Hirsch, who was a huge, well-known great rabbi, and so Rabbi Breuer had come over, and with him in the 50s, if you think of the world of the 50s, we were after the Holocaust, after World War II, and if you'll look on the memorial plaque, you'll notice there are people that started writing in that time period that they were writing a memorial for their deceased and all those people that died, all their family members that died in the Holocaust. Is all documented. So he wound up being the rabbi for his community from Germany. Was it Germany or Austria? Germany, thank you. So Frankfurt, thank you. So in other words, his family was well known in Frankfurt even before, and then you had the survivors of Frankfurt that were coming over, and they needed a new family, and they would a lot of times be the only survivor of their families. And again, we'll talk about the immigrant experience, but in Breuer's, it was nicknamed, his community was called Breuer's after him. It's the Washington Heights community. Found a home with Rabbi Breuer, and he took really great care of them. And a lot of them, with the monies that they had, would getting some reparations or whatever money they were able to scrap together, would buy houses on the mountaintop. And so the mountaintop, again, provided a very therapeutic, welcoming, healthy place for them to rejuvenate and to heal. And here's the Rabbi Schwab, who was he took over the rabbinate in Washington Heights when Rabbi Breuer semi-retired. And so here he is learning on the mountaintop. And this is bringing us to the modern day. So here's Rabbi Spitzer at a Veterans Day ceremony. And I think this is Orville Slusky's, from what I've been told, is right over here at the 100th anniversary dinner. Izzy, sorry. The other brother. Izzy, wearing a red hat, like that, like his. And this is Jacob Halberstam, who wrote one of the histories. This is Rabbi Spitzer, and this is, his name escapes me? Beckhofer, Jerry, thank you. Jerry Beckhofer. So, who is, was a stalwart of the community. What? Son-in-law, right, of Rabbi Breuer. And Maida Beckhofer, who's Rabbi Breuer's daughter, still walks around the community. In her, I won't say her age, but she's definitely the matriarch of the community. Okay, so I actually, whenever you write a history, I should never have written a history, but I love you guys, it's really great. But because there's always stuff you're not going to figure out until after you published it, and you're like, oh no. And plus there's that spelling mistake on page 82, you're like, oh my gosh, this is really awful. And this talk just proves that there's more out there, and I by no means do I believe I've captured everything. And of course, history is always being written, and that's what we're here. We're writing the next 100 years of both the mountaintop. And really, I think that there has been a convergence of the Jewish community's history with the mountaintop. I don't think we're talking about separate communities. I really do see it as one whole community. So these are definitely those backgrounds. And we'll leave you with this. This is from the 1920s. This is an advertisement for Tannersville. Any questions? Any questions for real?
Gary,
Yeah.
since you're a historian, just to correct the record,
Yeah, please.
the picture of Rabbi Spitzer was taken not at a Veterans Day event, but it was a Memorial Day event.
Okay, thank you.
And the reason why he got to speak is because his congregant, which is the ward,
Oh,
is the head of the VFW when he asked him
The American Legion.
of the American Legion, asked him to speak.
And there's Mr. Wilson there, right next to that.
oh, that's him?
So he was left, there you go. That's true, yeah.
Yep.
Well, what you don't know, Gary, is that Mrs. Holmesbaum's grandson is still here. He
Oh,
is in the audience today.
excellent, excellent.
Who's this?
Yeah, please.
Just one thing, one of the things you said there was a risk averse, I didn't know what that term
Risk
meant.
averse.
They're not, in other words, I'm risk averse. You know, if you look at my
Don't wanna take
portfolio,
risks.
right? It's if you look at like your stock portfolio, you try to diversify between safe risk and good risk and bad risk. So if you're risk averse, it means you're going to have more in bonds. You know, things that are more stable. If you're not as risk averse, you're going to be more in stocks. So immigrants were less risk averse because they, in order to be able to pick up and leave a place where you had been, yet you have to be not so scared of things. Yes, please.
I've lived here 12, 13 years, and my wife tells me a story that a peddler came up the mountain
Yeah,
and then died up here.
that's Dove Honingstown.
He said that.
We can. I'm not going to go all the way back there. Yeah, that was the founding father of the Honingstown. Am I saying it right? Honingstown. Okay.
Thank you
I
very much, it was so informative, I really enjoyed it.
I mean, and I didn't have a chance to interview all of you. I'm not asking to, but if more than I'm happy to update the book. You know, if there's stuff that I missed, I invite you to reach out to Dee Dee. I'm happy to talk with you because again, the history is of your families, and it's of your cousins and founders. It's like I can connect back to the 1880s, but my history is really since I got married to my wonderful wife Mia. But so I welcome any feedback if there's stuff that's gaps. Please, happy to incorporate it.
Just want,
Yeah.
I'd like to focus on your still making history and integration of the Jewish population in Tannersville. At this point, it's very important, I think, to focus on that as well.
Yeah, for sure.
It's to help when you republish the book, you'll also do it in large print.
Okay.
Or give him a magnifier.
Or I can come read it to you.
Or a magnifier.
Audiobook.
Thank you very much.